we say that if, for example, the council votes will get to decide which refugees go where according to the setting, and let me finish first. According to the setting, and if the council gets to decide, we say you have to comply to it because you've opted into the council and move forward with it. We say that the minimum standards need to be maintained. If you don't, you will be seen under prosecution in ICC if required. However, if you mistreat the refugees in any way, you will face some sort of pressure. Yes. Closing.
Germany already takes 500,000 refugees. The United States takes 800,000. Already, the richest countries in the world are taking the most. Why?
So understand this. We will fix it according to what you can take. But more importantly, if you're already taking a large proportion of it, and we say you're doing enough for them, we'll give it to the lazy countries who don't want to do enough, right? So that's not a proper contingent to what's happening. We say if you can and if you should, you will. But more importantly, let's understand who these refugees are. First, the reason why these refugees need most is because they are the most vulnerable individual, a causal effect of a disaster that they did not even cause themselves. They did not even bring it upon themselves, which means they're absolutely helpless. But more importantly, these are usually refugees. Refugees from all corners of the world don't get equal priority. If we have a proper constitution or a body determining which refugees go where, we say that the bias of certain refugees don't exist. For example, while Palestine is a big issue and a political issue, Ebola virus and people dying of malaria and people running out of Sierra Leone because of some disaster, some internal issue is not the biggest political crime. Why do we say that's a bad thing? We say just because a certain place gets a higher political view does not mean those people deserve a higher benefit. We say every refugee deserves equal rights and should be given equal priority. And that is the main reason why we bring this under the big paradigm. No. But more importantly, what is the problem in the present scenario? The problem in the present scenario is as these disasters increase in number, no country takes responsibility on a structured level to make sure that these disasters don't get worse. What's the impact? Number one, the impact falls not only on the refugees, of course. The refugees suffer like crazy because the only alternatives they have, if they're not taken in by some other country voluntarily, is one, they get out of desperation, flee their own country, get into another country, crossing the borders. What happens then? As we've seen in Rohingyas going into Bangladesh, have been captured and put into prison, even killed at some point because they were not wanted in the certain country. So when they flee into the second country across borders, they are slaughtered or they're treated, mistreated, maltreated. That's the one alternative. Second, the other alternative is that because the countries keep going here, there, everywhere, they don't seem to comply with it. The refugees don't seem to get any confirmed shelter, which is a bad thing because these refugees have to stay within that disastrous situation unsanitarily without any water and die if they're not removed. Before I move on, opening clarification. You got a clarification.
Yeah. Will you do anything if they choose to leave the convention because of...
Yeah, exactly. So here is what we say. One, if they choose to leave the convention, we say they will be dished out of UN. And also, if they choose to leave the convention, that convention, right? If they choose, they'll be dished out of that certain UN convention. But if they ditch the convention, we say if it's very prominent, we persecute them under ICC. Why is this? This persecution is required because these individuals had opted into this convention knowing what the rights of these people are. And this is my second contention. If you know what the rights of these people are, if you know what they suffer, if you know what they've suffered through, what they do suffer through, and the kind of rights they get, you recognize that these individuals are human beings and they deserve these rights. If you've signed into that or opted into that yourself, you have the obligation to make sure that these people get those rights that you have signed into. And you need to prove to us that they don't. But more importantly, we say inaction is a form of silence that cannot be tolerated in today's world. That when you do not act, you promote that certain suffering. And you say that to promote or support that certain suffering because you did not care enough is absolutely untrue. Why don't people care? Because it does not impact them directly. And this is very unfortunate. Just because a country beside you is not getting screwed over and in war or in famine, you do not understand the suffering of these people. And we say this form of inaction or complicity is awful, especially especially in the times that where in the world you also get impacted because of refugees, other issues come about. But more importantly, we have to understand what are the impacts that happen if you don't take in these refugees. Primarily, the countries within the proximity of the disaster suffer the most, because these refugees flee into these countries, clamoring those areas. But more importantly, African refugees fleeing into another warlord African country does not help the country, neither does it help the refugee. Which means it escalates the violence within the world throughout. We say the escalation of violence throughout the world ensures that at some point your country will also suffer. The reason why IS got so strong is because when Sunnis were being crippled inside Iraq and Syria, nobody came into their help. When Sunnis wanted to flee, nobody came into their help, and that caused the IS to spur violently. We say these occurrences will keep happening if you do not help them out. But more importantly, what is the problem? We say primarily the opposition has to show to us that there is no moral obligation to save these individuals that you recognize have this problem. Second, we will also tell you that you have to prioritize some of these large inconveniences for your smaller inconveniences. And thirdly, we'll make sure you face lesser inconveniences. Just take the responsibility that you have. Thank you.
Two things. First, can the audience be way more quiet than they were in the scene? And secondly, can we welcome the leader of the opposition?
We in the opening opposition think it's disastrous when we try to recharacterize what a moral imperative is, and it's even more disastrous when you try to change a moral goodwill imperative into a legal obligation. It's both principally and practically harmful for both the countries under these obligations and for people who want to help from opening government, right? So I'm going to do three things in my speech, right? I'm going to tell you exactly what this minimum quota and this tradable quota is going to do, because we understand that CRSR is already in place. So we need to make sure what this motion actually proposes and clear up most of the stuff that came up from opening government. Then we're going to talk to you about how, on a principle and practical level, why having this minimum quota is bad. And then in my third level, I'm going to talk about this trading system, something that she didn't really deal with, but I think it's an important part of this debate, why this is harmful, and this disproportionately benefits richer countries or more developed countries and disadvantages underdeveloped countries in today's status quo. So before that, a few rebuttals, right? Some things that just need to be cleared out the way before I respond to most of the things that are going to be amalgamated in my substantives, right? First, she says that refugees need to be defined, because right now, when you're an Ebola refugee, then you don't really get as much help as, for example, a Palestinian refugee. We think this can easily be worked into part of the CSR, which is already part of status quo, right? There is no reason why we need to impose a minimum quota or a tradable quota in order for us to do this or to redraw the boundaries of what it means to be a refugee. But more importantly, when we ask her about the consequences of us ditching this convention, right, because we think it's a very practical effect that when you force countries into obligations, they'll somehow try to escape it. Her solution was that we'll prosecute them, and if we don't, right, we'll kick them out of the UN. We think this is ridiculous. We think this is disastrous, because the minute you kick someone out of the UN, it makes it even much more harder for us to enforce any sort of goodwill imperative or legal obligations against these sort of countries. We think it's disastrous at what opening government is trying to propose. But let's move on to the three main things I'll talk about. Firstly, what will this minimum quota actually do, right? Because when we look at what's actually in the CRSR, right, it's a treaty that defines who refugees are, sets out the rights and responsibilities of these countries, right? So they cannot, in good faith, deny access to these refugees. So but it doesn't enforce any legal obligation onto these countries to take refugees. And that's the specific contention that we have from opposition, right? It's the transforming of a goodwill obligation into a legal obligation that we have problems with, right? Because we think that in general treaties don't bind, right? Even though Australia might be a signatory to this treaty, we see that they're constantly turning away these sorts of refugees, right? But the important thing is what happens when you turn this into a legal obligation, right? Two things that I'm going to talk about, right? This is why the minimum quota first is principally and practically harmful, right? Why is it principally harmful? They wanted to talk about moral imperatives. Let's talk about moral imperatives, right? We believe that as a sovereign state, your moral imperative lies to the citizens of your country, and it doesn't your moral imperative doesn't transform into to citizens outside your borders. We believe that goodwill imperatives can go out to citizens outside your border, but this should remain as a goodwill imperative. Why? Because we think that having a treaty that gives that, and let's go through some basic argumentation about why people shouldn't be obligated to take in like immigrants, right? We think that or refugees. We think that the minute that you take in these sorts of massive amounts of refugees that you want to propose on your side, right? This proportionally harms the sort of the citizens of your own countries, right? Welfare benefits cannot be given out because you have to set up infrastructure for these sorts of refugee camps. Simple argumentation. But on a more complex level, right? I think it's practically harmful even for the refugees that they want to help. Why? Because first, we think that in your best case scenario, these refugees have a mildly comparatively better situation. But we think that in reality, right, most of the time, these refugees will be treated to even worse obligations, right? Because we don't think that in the CRSR, we don't think that we can enforce any sort of really hard obligations on these countries, given the fact that if you want people to join your treaty, these obligations are going to be very simple. So we think that in most of these situations, right, these refugees are going to be worse off, right? Because we think that when we group them in these countries, there's things like community-based diseases that they have to deal with, things like shared conditions that they have to deal with, right? Second harm, we think that it's going to force these countries to repatriate even more of these refugees, right? Because we think that currently, if you look at American policy when dealing with these refugees, right, yes, we take them in, but we repatriate them as fast as possible. We don't think helps any of the situations that they want to talk about. Thirdly, it removes any social capital in the country to actually help these refugees or make the situation any better, right? Because what was now a goodwill obligation on the part of the country becomes a legal obligation. So it's harder for you to justify why you should be passing legislation to make harder to justify to your citizens why you should be passing legislation that benefits these refugees when you're just following a simple legal obligation instead of doing anything out of goodwill. We think it's harmful when you transform a goodwill obligation into a legal obligation, right? Last harm, we think that these countries will just leave this treaty altogether. We don't think that their penalty of kicking out of the UN is actually going to pass any sort of resolution in the General Assembly. But before that, yes.
These countries have opted in to accept refugees. In other words, they already have the political capital. How then do you ensure they treat these refugees as they should and not dump them in Papua New Guinea?
We think that the status quo is good enough, right? We think that Australia is facing a lot of flack for not taking in these refugees. We think that because it's based on goodwill, the international community can then enforce this sort of goodwill, right? We don't think that, and this leads me on to my second part, which is why this trading system, which they never wanted to deal with, is essentially harmful to the very policy or the very people that they want to help, right? Because when we look at, why is this trading system harmful? Because we say it disproportionately benefits developed countries and disadvantages underdeveloped countries. Why is that so? Because when it's tradable, right, we have to realize that when you want to trade, you need to have leverage. Who has leverage in the current geopolitical status quo? It's these developed countries that can pump in money to these countries or can have some sort of political leverage in international arenas, right? So we think what's most likely going to happen is that these developed countries are going to, in their self-interest, trade away the sort of moral responsibilities or the moral goodwill responsibilities that we have now in status quo, right? And also, secondly, apart from the self-interest of these companies, we think it's simply geographical, that certain countries will then this will disadvantage certain countries, right? The reason why people seek refuge is because of geographical concerns. So what's going to happen is that these people are going to flood their geographical neighbors, who will then be forced by these developed countries to take more of the developed countries' quotas and to increase their quotas, right? We think this is harmful to these developing countries geographically close to the conflict for all the harms that I already talked about earlier in my speech. But even more than that, why is the comparative better, right? Because when it's placed on goodwill, we think we can put international pressure on these developed countries, right? These developed countries that have the capacity to take in these refugees and who, for all intents and purposes, will be better for these refugees, right? The minute you take away that and you allow them to trade away this moral imperative or this goodwill obligation, what happens then is that the international community loses the sort of moral leverage that you can use to enforce or to at least tell these countries they're doing something wrong. Because the minute you can trade away your moral obligations, we don't think that you're going to follow them. You're simply going to say, look, we've followed the law, we've followed this motion that you want to pass, and we're not supposed to take in any more treaties, right? That's why we think that when you transform this goodwill imperative that countries have currently towards these refugees into a legal obligation, it makes it easier to escape these imperatives, and it harms the very people that opening government and probably closing government want to help. That's why I'm supremely proud to propose. Thank you.
Two things again. First one is please don't talk during people's speeches. We have 8 of the best speakers in the world talking, so listen to them and you can talk from 7 p.m. tonight until the final and all that tomorrow. The second thing is we'll have the Deputy Prime Minister, please.
Summary of opening opposition case. We recognize that refugees live in a bad problem, but let's resort to international pressure because that always works when making sure countries do what they need to, right? We from the opening government don't mince words. We recognize that refugees are one of the most disadvantaged with the least amount of capital to do what they need to be done to them, right? And we tell you that there needs to be something done. So what's the sort of material that came out from opening opposition? The first line of argumentation is the countries are going to just shut up shop and leave. We don't really think it's going to be that simple, right? People do not usually leave UN because most of these countries are taking some level of responsibility anyway. One. Second, there are significant backlashes when you're dealing with leaving UN altogether anyway, right? So you're losing face to your own people, you're losing face in the international arena, you have a lot of other international commitments that are contingent upon how much of a good boy you are, right? So it's not as easy as shutting up shop and leaving. Secondly, they concede that there needs to be some amount of pressure exerted on countries that are that do not listen, right? And then they say this is going to be all of the pressure that we need. It is international pressure. If international pressure works, we're fine with that as well, right? What we want is the system that makes sure that these countries do as they do. We are fine to escalate it as much as possible, but they have agreed in principle to our remark, right? Second, there's a bizarre idea that refugees have worse conditions in these sorts of lands, in these settlements. We think that's absolute rubbish. When you're escaping from famine, when you're escaping from natural disaster, when you're escaping from war, probably even if the asylum doesn't have a latrine, you still probably have a better system to live in, right? So that we don't really see how the conditions are better. Moreover, if you think it's so bloody important to make those basic conditions better, we're absolutely fine with improving those conditions as the minimum standard, and we're okay if you do that. Then they bring up the next contention that this goodwill needs to be goodwill because you have a moral prerogative towards your own citizens. Here, ladies and gentlemen, this idea assumes that you have absolutely no responsibility to people who happen to be born outside your borders. We think that's garbage again. You have a significant amount of responsibility to people, your neighbors as well, right? Which is why we don't dump materials and nuclear waste in water, which is going to go to our neighbors. Government policy does have to take into account the sort of actions and ramifications it has on the rest of the world. So their idea exists in a vacuum where your actions should only cater to your people. We tell you, no, there is a trade-off to be had. Fine. You prioritize your people, which is why we look at the amount of landmass you have, which is why we look at the amount of money you are able to realistically give for this prospect. As a result, we do that. When the trade-off, ladies and gentlemen, is some degree of economic hardship, because they never characterize that, but what degree of economic hardship this is, there some degree of economic hardship, some degree of probable social hardship, with saving the lives of hundreds of thousands of people who have been disadvantaged and disenfranchised by this system. We tell you we bite the bullet, and we tell you that these are one of the situations where your responsibility goes further than your personal opinions and your personal countries, right? So before I move on, yes, Miza.
Do you think the moral stance of the United Nations should be that each country should take in as many as they can, or is it that it's a minimum?
We think that the moral stance of the United Nations should be each country has to take at least this amount, but moreover, if you want to take more, we are happy with that. The current problem, ladies and gentlemen, is that not enough countries take as many as they realistically can, right? Because a lot of countries are opting out or taking the easy way out, and we don't want to give them that. If you think enforcing of this demand is the problem, we are fine with making as many enforcement mechanisms as you want, right? But the idea is, should there be a framework? Then they can come up with this allegation that, look, the moment you do this, weaker countries suffer. We don't really see how. For example, right now, when refugees suffer or flee from Myanmar into Bangladesh, there's significant international pressure for Bangladesh to accept. Now, Bangladesh is stuck between a rock and a very hard place, because either they send these refugees back and ask them to go back to their homeland where they'll be shot or shoot them themselves, or more or worse, accept refugees in a country which has already 180 million people. However, either of these choices does not compensate Bangladesh for taking these refugees. Under our model, a country which can afford to do this takes it. Or even if Bangladesh is the one that is taking it, it gets fairly compensated, because a developed country then has to offer a significant amount of money, which is then acceptable to Bangladesh as cost for having that refugee in its own borders, right? So even under our model, we are protecting the interests and we're protecting the little guy. Their model is the one that forces these refugees from exiting Syria and back into Sudan, or exiting Syria and getting into Turkey, right? With no infrastructure, no way for them to be anything but aliens. We think that's absolutely abhorrent. Now, moving on into my own constructives. I have two issues. Number one, how UN is a bit of a pussy and needs to be fixed. But number two, ladies and gentlemen, there is a significant amount of bullying involved with the current process, and we find that a bit repugnant, not taken up. When we look at the inception of UN, the idea was it will deal with the big problems in the world, it will deal with all of the structural issues that are there, right? However, up until now, we've worked towards reducing conflict, we've worked towards all of these things without coming up with a proper structure that does all of these things. When we look at this issue, we see that the biggest problem UN faces across any of its fields, be it peacekeeping, be it other resource allocation, has always been a lack of ability to enforce what they want to do, right? Because everyone, because of the nature of the UN, it is a system where everyone either opts out or opts in or doesn't. We need to have some degree of enforcement and legislation. We tell you that this is the first step of making UN a system which actually offers solutions and not a stopgap which just throws around money. Right? We need to have a solution for the long run. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, when we look at when we zoom in on the issue of these refugees specifically, we see that in a lot of these cases, the amount of benefits of the system that is awarded to these refugees are often circumstantial, right? So we look at different parts of the world with different sorts of problems, where you see that in a lot of these cases, larger countries refuse to take part at all, apart from just brokering, right? When there are problems like transportation of these refugees, say from Africa, to extradition of these refugees in the first place, one. Second, in terms of rehabilitation and returning into the lands where they come from, we definitely need the input and the ability of these larger countries to actually help them rehabilitate. The current system, which has a disproportionate amount of refugees because of the neighboring countries, automatically can't stop them from coming in, or for other reasons that they enter the borders. The current system means that in a lot of these cases, because these neighboring countries have their own problems as well, these refugees then enter and infiltrate those societies, creating problems with their own, where a better structure, where you know that which is going to be the transport route, you know that who's going to be in charge of where they go and the basic systems, and what is the process of rehabilitating them in the long run once the problem has been solved, that is there, right? So ladies and gentlemen, everyone is in the side of refugees in this house, and they will do the same. Everyone recognizes UN is a stupid organization that has failed to do most of its things. So everyone knows UN needs to have teeth. We are giving it teeth to solve a big problem. Thank you.
We now welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Test. In my fourth semifinals, and the second time in a row that I'm doing a motion on refugees back-to-back on ABP motions, I'm actually very proud to oppose this motion for the first time. There are a few interesting things we need to consider in this. The first thing we're going to talk about is this principal issue, and then I'm going to talk about how their policy effectively doesn't solve anything. I'm going to add some more to this debate, but talk about how this policy destroys the kind of progress we've made as far as the CRSR is concerned, vis-a-vis refugee taking in as a principle. First, principle. So the main ambit that the opening government must run is that all governments have to take note of the interactions with other countries. That is why you don't dump waste in other countries, and you don't go about setting bombs off in other countries for fun, which we currently do, actually. But the point is this. There is a difference between these two actions. In one case, you're doing things that actively harm other countries, and in the situation we're talking about now, you're willingly doing things that make people's lives better. There's obligation in the former, but there is an obligation in the latter. That's just clear and unfortunately true. We didn't intervene in places like Chechnya, Kosovo, Serbia, Bangladesh, even though there were grave human rights abuses in these areas, presumably much more than what's going on in refugee situations, because the obligation required these places was for you to take a positive step in these places, and there just isn't any principle that requires you to do this, no matter how much you scream about how sad the situations are. Yes?
As I said in my speech, when you don't give refugees these instances, extremist groups get created, which harms your country. Yep. Technically speaking, you're trying to protect yourself.
Sure, but unless you can kind of solve the problem going on in these places to which refugees stem out from, you're not going to solve the creation of these extremist groups anyway. So to that extent, we're happy to first emphasize what really is going to solve the problem of refugees. But anyway, the point is this. We understand that it is much better if they can get to these places than where they came from. That just seems simple, right? And therefore, the real question is whether or not get to these places is a lot what Zhen He said dealt with that, but wasn't really responded to. But the bigger question really is this, that we understand that, yes, largely we need to get to these spaces, but it also means that you need to consider what happens when they get there. And there's no part of the policy that copes with the issue that once they get to these spaces, these countries have every ability to deport and repatriate them back to the places that they used to come from. And that's the exact policy that the United States of America is using vis-a-vis South American refugees going to their places as well. And that's a big shortfall in the policy that Zhen He talked about, but wasn't closed out by the Deputy Prime Minister. We also talked to you about in these places, there are big questions, how do you balance these kinds of opinions in the first place? He said that, well, we can just get these kinds of money in the cost to repatriate the kinds of shortfalls that we have without realizing the big problem often at times isn't just money, because states have a lot of money. The problem is whether or not they want to spend this money on these refugees. And exactly as what Mustafa said, it often is a good balance between how much I'm spending on them versus how much I'm spending on the rest of my population. And once you accept the balance, we think it'd be less likely that these people, or less money we spend to these areas in the first place. Never mind the fact that a big problem is the issue of land space, that you're trapping these individuals into an extremely confined area to begin with. So let's get on to the real issue of this debate and policy, right? The first thing we want to talk about is who really takes up this policy and who really takes up refugees, which is a big issue in this debate that really wasn't analyzed or really understood by the opening government, which is this. That if you consider the many parts of the world that have refugee problems, they often tend to be, unfortunately, the smaller countries in which these kinds of disputes usually take place in. The result of this usually is that countries bordering these areas usually are the ones naturally that take up most of these refugees. The consequence of which is to have bigger countries, or the problem that the world faces now is how do we get bigger countries like the United States of America, China, India, Australia, who are usually far away, geographically, thankfully, from these areas of disputes to take up more refugees than they currently do. The problem is that their policy is extremely blind to this, because even though they may say that their ability to attach quotas is based on your land size, they then allow these countries to trade away those quotas to places that are currently already burdened or already are filling over the edges with refugees in the first place. Effectively, what their policy does, no thank you, because it will be decided by a council, which will be run by these places in the first place, is allow these places to exactly determine the kinds of quotas that are convenient for them. But more than that, even if they don't do this, they can use money to sell away their obligations on a moral scale to these places that are currently overwhelmed by these refugees in the first place. No, thank you. Effectively, this means their policy doesn't get refugees to the places that we need to get refugees to in the first place. And that really is the problem with this debate, that the policy doesn't solve, which is why I'm happy to say, at best, their scenario or their case creates the exact same problem that we face currently in today's world. No thanks. But the second thing I'm going to talk to you about, and what my added material is going to be here, is this. That a great development of international law, or a great development of any kinds of international treaty regimes or such, is entirely based on the ability of countries to feel safe about their sovereign right to do things. And the big part of these international regimes are all based first on balancing the kinds of views or sovereign abilities that your states or the obligations you have to the people who voted you to these positions in the first place. Because it is them that created your country that gave you international presence, such that we're discussing any of this in the first place. But beyond that, being able to invite people into these treaties means that you need to be able to acquiesce their kinds of sentiments or kinds of fears that they have. At the point in which you threaten countries that if they don't properly fulfill their quotas, they will be either sent to the ICC or kicked out of the United Nations, we hardly think that any of the countries that we need to take on more refugees will be interested in staying on with the CRSR regime. And the problem is this, that we accept that the CRSR regime has been incredibly successful and incredibly good at what is achieved up to this point. It's an excellent representation of what we've achieved insofar as we are concerned refugees as a whole. But all of this was a balance of what international regimes of states had in mind vis-a-vis their own internal obligations and domestic concerns. At the point in which you threaten the ability to stay within the United Nations, you immediately lose the support of these countries and any willingness of their ability to come forward to have any kinds of set measures, even on the domestic level, to come forth and be more open to these refugees in the first place. The summary of the opening government's case is to laugh at the opening opposition's case about international pressure without realizing first that their system is reliant on that same international pressure, but second of all, most perniciously allowing the international pressure to ruin the entire regime of refugee systems or the feelings we have towards refugees in the first place. At best, their policy means that big countries can sell off this moral obligation that we think no country should be able to sell off in the first place to countries that are already overburdened by refugees. But at worst, what happens is that you disincentivize these countries from joining the regime that supports refugees in the first place. It encourages more conservative aspects, more conservative policies that restrict these individual countries from allowing these people in. I can sign up to your regime, but still create domestic policies that make it extremely difficult for refugees to get into my country. And that's exactly what they will do when you allow these policies to take root in this particular system, and you subject and you threaten these countries that we currently need these refugees to go to oblige themselves by a system that other people, presumably, if they, in the best case scenario, policy creates. That is why we think, Mr. Speaker, that we understand there's a problem, and we understand that our policy is perhaps slower to achieve it than the best case idyllic scenario of theirs. But the reality is that because their case is best case and idyllic, they're not going to achieve it and only make things worse, and that's why we're happy to oppose.
We welcome the government member now, please.
Mr. Speaker, I have never been prouder to stand here and propose a motion in favor of my friends in Australian camps in Republic of Guinea being beaten up to death by Republic of Guinean soldiers and not receiving medical care, so they have to abort their children. That's a sort of behavior and attitude that these people are receiving. People who have lived a life full of resentment, they went through a lot of struggles to eventually end up in Australia and then end up in Republic of Guinea to die. That's a sort of behavior that we oppose from closing government. That's a sort of behavior we want to remove in this debate. I want to talk to you about two things in my debate, right? Firstly, I want to talk to you about the refugee himself, the promises that he has been made to a refugee and the rational calculus of a refugee is why that's something that we should consider, a lot of individualized harm there. And secondly, I'm going to talk to you about why there is a natural incentive to accept these refugees. And these refugees are not essentially as useless as side opening opposition wants to talk about. That's why a lot of countries like Norway and Sweden, they have an open arm when it comes to refugees and accept them with very low conditions. But let's look at the sort of characterization that we need to have. A lot of this process that is happening, it's essentially a bad thing, right? For example, when it comes especially to the Australian government, right? They are paying the government of the Republic of Guinea, right, just to take care of their refugees. There is no accountability, there is no assurance, there is no Australian inspection to ensure that these people and individuals are going to be taken care of. I think there is a lack of incentive for countries, for the third world countries to take care of these refugees because they need the money, they are poor, and they're going to use it in the other sources. So they're not going to provide it. And they haven't promised a championing of human rights. So they really care about the refugees that you outsource to their countries. But the offers that has been made to these particular individuals are somehow ridiculous. For example, it has been offered to these refugees that we pay you 3,000 Australian dollars, so you go back to your own country, to the land that you might get killed the moment that you step in, right? For example, if you're a North Korean person who has opposed Kim Jong-un, the moment that you step in North Korea, you're going to be killed, right? So that's a sort of offer, a ridiculous offer that has been made to that particular individual. But in the other cases, in other countries, for example, in Germany, the process is so long, and a lot of people, they have spent up to 5 to 6 years just to stay in camps and to be limited. And the most problematic thing about this individual is that this individual, they remain unidentified. They don't have a clear future what to do. So and they will be restricted and being under the constant. This is something that we should address, and it's something that we should do, and we think that's something problematic. But let's look at the first argument that I want to bring to you and talk to you about. The rebuttal is going to be integrated to my argument as well, right? No, thank you. See, let's look at how is a refugee and why we are morally obliged to this particular individual, right? The opening hour has talked to you about the sort of process and the things that these people do, right? But we need a little more nuances to understand this characterization, right? See, fleeing from your country, for example, from Iran, or for example, from Saudi Arabia, just because you are gay and society doesn't accept you, is not an easy process, right? You have to conceal your identity. You have to walk through jungles. You have to swim through seas just to get to somewhere safe, right? Just because you can assume that, that one particular country, for example, in Australia, they changed their policy suddenly, that we don't think that's fair for these particular individuals, right? They made that decision based on the premise that these countries are open to accepting refugees. The perception illusion that was created by these particular countries, the promise that is being made, right? And these people are not in the most accessible part of the world when it comes to information. For example, if you are in China or you are in North Korea, the accessibility of information about what is going on in the world is something bad. If you're a North Korean, the only thing that you are thinking of is that safe haven that you can get to, which is Australia, is that safe haven that you can get into, which is Norway or Sweden. So you make an informed decision based on a perception, but not based on the detailed nuances information that you might have been received. So the moment that you get into Australia, right, and we treat you based on objective measures that we have, we think is unfair. And the only way that we can remove that, and the only way that we can avert that, is to provide a treaty that makes it tradable. That firstly, we are telling you that you're obliged to accept this particular individual, but more importantly, if you cannot take care of them, don't send it to Guinea, send it to Norway and send it to Sweden, somewhere that they can be taken care of and they can get the props. But more importantly, I think there is another heart, right? When it comes to a lot of UN refugees, that they exist in the particular country, right? They have given the UN status, they are considered UN refugees, but they don't hold the particular citizenship of any particular countries, right? So these individuals are being literally treated as second-class citizens, right? Because the procedure of application of their visa is being pending, and because of the lack of the identity that they have is being there. Now we are creating an incentive and moral obligation to facilitate the process of accepting this individual, right? Now we are granting their rights. Now we are ratifying them as human beings and the human individuals to be accepted in society. But before I go to my most important extension, go ahead.
The UNHCR, who handles the allocation of refugees, already has a provision that disallows the repatriation of refugees to countries that are persecuting them for whatever reason. Can you tell us why that provision isn't enough for the countries that you've just mentioned?
Mr. Speaker, because I just gave you a couple of examples that it hasn't been worked, and I need to take a step further, right? Well, let's look at these refugees, right? Are they like so useless that nobody wants to take them in, and now we are going to force them to a specific countries? We don't think that's true, right? We think there are a lot of natural incentives for these countries to accept that. That's the very reason that, for example, I'm using graphic example that we accept 500,000 refugees or 500,000 immigrants to our country. It's very simple. Firstly, these refugees, they can come to our country and take care of a lot of the stuff that like our own people don't take care of. For example, when it comes to menial jobs, things that they are willing to take and they are willing to take care of, right? We think it's a good thing that we use that as a benefit because they concede to that. But more importantly, countries like Sweden and Norway, right? They have always been open to this to accepting refugees. Why? This is a simple thing. Firstly, firstly, because of the sort of social welfare that they have, right? Even if you're a refugee, the moment that you get to Norway, the day after you are sent to a school. So you learn Norwegian, and after that you go to a school and you become an educated system. So you become a skilled worker, specifically in that context when they are fighting and struggling with population and when they are struggling with the rate of birth that they have, right? But more importantly, not all these refugees, they're unskilled people. Most of these people are skilled people who are very educated and who have just left their country because their freedom of expression has been obsessed, right? And a lot of these people are being put into good use when it comes to these particular countries. So there is a natural incentive for countries like Norway and Sweden to accept all these refugees, right? And all we are doing, we are just facilitating through this treaty, through this agreement, to if you are not going to use that refugee, if you think that refugee is not valuable to you, there is another country out there who understand and values the value that exists in this particular refugee and want and need it. We think we have to, for the sake of refugees, we should go with side closing out.
Opposition member, please.
Good evening, Asia. I am happy to speak in front of a community that has already given refuge to these 3 foreign members of the adjudication panel. Ladies and gentlemen, UT Mara believes that the refugee cap and trade system that was proposed by the government bench is not just morally reprehensible, but it is practically ridiculous. We believe it is morally reprehensible to place valuations on the plight of refugees, as well as to force and allocate certain responsibilities to certain countries. We also believe that when we do place these valuations on how many we should take, it makes it harder, it makes it easier for countries to ignore this responsibility. Because now, and this is where we will extend the debate, now the focus no longer becomes whether or not it is a moral and a humanitarian thing to do, but it is a more financially viable thing to do. Ladies and gentlemen, let's be very clear about what we are willing to stand for on closing opposition. We are okay with a slight reduction in the quantity of refugees that are taken up by countries, so as long as we can ensure that the quality of life of these refugees are taken care of. We also think that it's actually a good thing that we are vague about how many refugees each country will take, because it's better than that we can force countries to do such things. Opening opposition talked about some very nice legal ideas, as well as telling you why no one will want to sign up or be a part of this convention anymore. We'll tell you why it's principally wrong, because now the richer you are, the less you have to take in, as well as secondly, how this fuels anti-immigration sentiment in countries, especially in states in Europe, which have already that sentiment. What was the problematic about the government's case in today's debate was that they lived in this utopia where member states will immediately acquiesce to the quota that was given to them. Their case is premised on each and every country accepting the quotas that they have been received. Because all those harms that Berat told you about, all his friends who are being, having things done to them, are more likely to be even worse, because poorer countries are going to be incentivized to take up more quotas. So firstly, is it principally right or practically viable to have a cap and trade system? We accept that it's important that countries do what countries that can help do help, but there are three ways how they harm this. Firstly, let's talk about responsibility towards citizens. So as much as we should be taking refugees from other countries, we think countries should be allowed to have primary responsibility and accountability to their citizens and their taxpayers. Because when you are a citizen and you vote in a government, you have a duty of care to those people to provide for them. You have a duty of care to taxpayers to ensure that infrastructure and as well as education goes towards them first. What happens under their model is that they make refugees scapegoats in instances where governments are inflexible to change around their budgets. Because under your model, governments just take in a quota, and then halfway through the year, we find that there's an economic recession, or your stock market goes crashing down, and refugees become the scapegoat and the straw man that society will use, just like what's happening in Australia. Secondly, you allow richer states to circumvent the system. This was talked through by opening opposition. But what we think, it's principally unfair, because countries that are able to do this are more likely to sell off their quotas in order to make it easier for these governments to get into power, right? So countries like Germany, countries like France, for example, who have already seen a rise of anti-immigrant parties like the French National Front, like the UK Independence Party in the United Kingdom, who have won remarkably high number of seats during the European Commission elections. These are the very states that are going to sell off these quotas, because their people, especially given their economic situation, are going to push their governments to sell off these quotas. Thirdly, you're going to victimize poorer states as well. The understanding that countries like Malaysia and Indonesia are also signatories to this convention, it is more likely that member states who are poorer will want to take up more refugees because they get more money for it, ladies and gentlemen. Understanding that these countries already face hardships in terms of getting loans from the IMF or getting money from the World Bank because their credit ratings are really crappy, what's more likely going to happen is that countries like Indonesia are just going to say, since I can't get a loan from the IMF, I might as well just take up more refugees and get paid for it, because I can trade those quotas around. Why is this harmful? Because these are the very countries that are unable or have the infrastructural inefficiencies to take care of these number of refugees. The quality of life of the refugees under your model is going to be even worse, because they're going to be going to poorer states who can't take care of them. And that's what you do, because you allow those caps to be traded. How to ensure that countries take up more refugees? This will be some more unique extensions that we'll have. This will also deal directly with what Berat told you. Firstly, we tell you that you give plausible deniability to countries, when, especially in the international community, when you do this. Why is this different, and how do we uniquely extend? When you give a flat number to a country, that means as long as they fulfilled their quotas, you are essentially saying they have fulfilled their responsibility to humanity, ladies and gentlemen. It's easier if it's vague. It's easier when it's vague, when Australia turns away boat people from Indonesia, because we can talk about it. We can say it's morally wrong. We can say you have to care about humanity. But if Australia can simply show a number to the international community and say, I fulfilled my 50,000 people quota, it gives them that deniability, especially in international conventions and international discourse, to say, I fulfilled my responsibility, I do not need to take up anymore. Before I move on to my other two levels, yes, Closing.
Okay, see, at one hand, you tell us that this particular individual have so much of a monetary value that become an incentive. At the same breath, you tell us that no, there is significant financial burden to the country that they're going to damage us, right? Which one is right and which one and why?
Yes, because when you take in a refugee, that cost is a lot more than the cost of just selling off a quota. So a country that is imposed with a quota will want to get rid of it because keeping a refugee for their entire lives is a lot more expensive than just simply selling off the quota to another country. Second point of extension, how does this shift attention and concerns, how does this shift the attention from concerns of humanity to financial concerns? Already we see that public discourse and discussion when it comes to taking refugees is centered around money. How much do we have? How much infrastructure do we have to take in refugees? So it's already able, countries are already able to use it as an excuse to not take up more refugees. What you do is now you shift that discourse even further away from humanity and from moral responsibilities towards, can we afford these people or can we just sell off the quotas? That means public discourse on your model is going to be centered around money rather than the moral responsibility to help. Thirdly, you make anti-immigration sentiments even worse because now you've put a valuation on what it means to take in refugees. You've already set a quota to say that 50,000 people equals to, let's say, $50 million in your trade system. What it's going to be, it's going to make it easier for anti-immigrant parties to come out in public and say, look, this is how much money we can make if we sell off our quotas. This is how much money we're about to lose if we take in these refugees. And when you make that a financial calculation, taking in refugees will always be a worse option, ladies and gentlemen. That's what we cannot afford. For all those reasons, we should let it be vague. We should turn it into a moral and humanitarian question. It shouldn't be about money. It should be about who deserves it and who can help them.
Really fast. Why are you walking? Did you wash your hands?
No response.
Government workplace.
Mr. Speaker, this debate isn't just about the number of refugees that countries take in. It is what we do with them and whether the United Nations has an obligation and whether it should have an ability to control the way these nations treat them. The reason why Australia can continue to do what it does is because there is no hard and fast way to determine that it is out of malicious intent, because there are no standards as to how these refugees should be treated. In other words, there is no real legal obligation to say you must process these refugees as fast as possible, else send them to another country by way of trading. One major contradiction in what Rafiq just came up here and told you. He told us that refugees cost us a lot of money in the long term, yet he told us that countries like Malaysia and Indonesia would happily accept refugees for money. We don't think that makes sense, because a country like Malaysia and Indonesia that is already in financial debt would not put itself in that position just because it needs money in the short term, because we don't think that these nations are so corrupt, so as to accept these policies. Major contradiction in their case. We don't understand then how their extension stands, because most of this side's case hinges upon the idea that all these refugees will be shoved away into developing nations because, hey, it's a lot easier to do that. A couple of things that we must recognize and understand in this debate before we begin talking about this case. First and foremost, we must recognize the existence of these refugees and the number in which they exist. But most importantly, we have to recognize that we are already at a point where we have volunteered to participate and where all these nations have already agreed to opt in, including the United Nations. In other words, your hands are in, you can't come out, you need to do something about it. Most importantly, as a result of this participation, we must also recognize the arising moral obligation and the promise that Behrad talked to you about. And I talked to you about how this system works better in ensuring a collective check and balance system in my analysis of this debate. The biggest question of this debate is, how do we optimize the process and therefore ensure better experience for these refugees, considering we're already accepting them? Before I move on, yeah.
Well, when you are a poor state, you're more likely to prioritize the fast cash that you can get from selling off your quotas rather than thinking about the long-term infrastructural inefficiencies that your country's.
I don't think it's infrastructural inefficiencies that you talk about. When you talk about a refugee, I think your own case already established that there's a significant aversion within these countries, a lot worse in developing nations, in terms of accepting any of these refugees. So if the long-term harm is a financial deficit, which I don't think will be long-term, so to speak, because how much is a country going to pay in order to push a refugee? Because if it's a lot easier for you to take a refugee than to pay for one, you probably will opt for that. In other words, the reasonable assumption is the sum of money paid is not remotely even enough to offset the sort of expense of having a refugee, unless you're trying to tell us that every single government in a developing nation really has no idea what it's doing. I think Mahathir would beg to disagree in Malaysia. So would most of the Malaysians here. Let's analyze a few things before I move on to a greater analysis of what Behrad can talk to you about and how it was left unopposed. First, the primary issue they have over here is that these third world nation members of this policy or this convention will be harmed. First and foremost, we don't think there are a lot of them. Second, even if there were a lot of them, we think that the policy that exists in terms of regulating the minimum quota of these nations would ensure that they have either zero, because they're countries like Somalia, or that have a reasonable number when it comes to countries like Malaysia. Hence, there's already a regulation that exists in terms of ensuring that these nations are not being abused. But more importantly, the sort of moral obligation or the international pressure they talk about in terms of ensuring that these nations don't ever breach a certain moral standard is what will fuel it here. In other words, when there is a written down hard and fast legal obligation to protect these refugees, even if they're not on your ground already, would mean that these nations can't just dump them in Papua New Guinea. Why? Because you have the option and ability to either take them in or put them to a country like Norway. That already resolves the idea of third world nations. It's already a great disincentive to dump them there because of this legal obligation and the sort of moral obligation that comes out of it. They told us that internally there'll be a significant rise in the sort of conservative policies that exist. First and foremost, we tell you that these nations have no incentive whatsoever to opt out, sit down, because of the sort of international pressure they've already conceded to. If you believe that international pressure will work under your model, why would it not work under our model, where we're creating a greater enforceability of law? Sit down. In other words, even if you have domestic policy, it is always contingent upon foreign policy. Why? Because foreign policy is what determines your ability to participate globally, which also is part of your your domestic security when it comes to issues like the Islamic State and the degree of cooperation that you're willing to put, or the degree of cooperation of other nations. Sit down. This sort of global obligation will be sufficient deterrent. Now let's move on to addressing Rafiq's speech extensively, then going back to Behrad. So first and foremost, he told us about selling off quotas, and we've already talked about that. But let's talk about plausible deniability. Great. The thing is, right now, countries already set a benchmark as to how much is enough. Australia does that. It tells its people 100,000 refugees, for instance, is enough. Whereas if we have 200 million global refugees, it's very difficult to have that subjective debate. Now, when we come here and say this is the minimum standard of refugees that you can take, we actually create a greater incentive for these nations to take more, because your image in the global community is harmed when you're put up against other nations that take more than the minimum. In other words, the nations like Norway, which are happy to absorb refugees, are more than happy to make you look like a horrible person when you take only the minimum benchmark. That is the benefit of setting a bit of a minimum benchmark, because the sort of moral or global pressure will push you to taking it more, because people are not happy when you look like you're the moral underdog. They told us there's public outrage when it comes to immigration in Europe. We tell you that there's already been precedent in a lot of nations that we take decisions against the interest of the public for a greater global interest. In other words, when we went to war in Iraq, in Syria, etc., there's already been public outrage. Why do we do this? Because we see a greater good. And we tell you the greater benefit over here is we've recognized and agreed to a moral obligation to protect refugees. We need to treat them the best way possible. I think that was extensively dealt with side opposition, primarily because their case hinges on developing nations. Let's look at what Behar, the company I talked to you about, Rafiq did not at all address. First, he told you about how these policies are ultimately unfair, and the tradability essentially creates an obligation to accept. This is the collective identity that I was talking about earlier on. When these nations are part of a system that makes it everyone's responsibility to ensure refugees are treated well, Germany can come out and say, Australia is a bad country for not accepting refugees, because I'll turn around and say, well, Germany, you had the option of taking that refugee, why don't you do so? It creates that collective responsibility that creates a natural check and balance within the system to ensure that these refugees are accepted one way or another. That sort of global mobility is something that you can never ever access any other way. Berhard also told you about how these individuals always leave their nations on the basis of goodwill and good faith. And the absence of an objective standard of how they will be treated is something that we find problematic, because the convention only states the rights of these individuals and how you should treat them. But if they're not on your land, you can't do, you don't have that obligation. Now we force you to accept these individuals because of this minimum quota, and therefore are more able to enforce these rights that we lay out. But the last one is, Behrad told you in a more responsive manner that these individuals are not really a harm to the nation in the way Rafiq talks about. These are people that build the country. Malaysia is built on immigrants, for heaven's sake. Ladies and gentlemen, this debate is about, considering that we've already accepted these refugees and we're already meddling with the process, how do we ensure their better treatment? We think a collective system that makes it a collective responsibility is the best check and balance. With that, we are proud to propose.
The debate, we'll have the opposition witness, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, this policy is not one of allocation. So closing government cannot tell us that this debate is about equitable distributions or making sure that individual countries get and are forced to take up refugees. The UNHCR already does that for us under status quo. The UNHCR already has an obligation that when refugees that cross borders on your shores, that you have to take them in. The UNHCR already reallocates and redistributes these refugees to countries that won't prosecute you for what you ran away for. The debate then becomes, what does setting a minimum standard do to changing how we feel and how we perceive the moral obligation that we feel to refugees across the world? Ladies and gentlemen, how does that affect the discussions that occur between individuals in countries when you have states that have UKIPs and Golden Dawns and national fronts, ladies and gentlemen? And we feel that the closing government have failed in engaging with the closing opposition in this debate. I'll analyze the responsibility for us to accept refugees on 3 levels. First, I'll analyze to you what is the premise of which we view responsibility, the frame of this obligation. Secondly, I'll tell you how or whether or not individuals will accept refugees, because the assumption on government is that richer countries like Germany and Sweden, with the provision of trading refugees, will now take it instead of trading it off to less fortunate or poorer countries for that cash. And thirdly, I'll talk to you a little bit about the treatment of refugees in the instance. Lastly, I'll go to our extension. But before that, yes, sir.
Tell us how you will ensure a significantly larger amount of collective responsibility to accept, because they could just dump them in the sea right now.
Ladies and gentlemen, there is already moral condemnation for individuals that drop individuals at sea. That's why there's moral condemnation for Australia for towing it to Nauru, or even rejecting the boat people, ladies and gentlemen, because it's fundamentally immoral and irresponsible. That happens under status quo, ladies and gentlemen. But when you have a minimum, Australia can say, we've already accepted 25,000, so you can just go back to the sea now, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why we think that that more minimum standard is worse off on that side of the house. Firstly, let's look at the frame of this obligation, because we think they've been highly unresponsive to even our POIs, because we told you that the current system of which the UN operates is that the message is that if you can accept these individuals, then to the fullest extent that you are able to, then you should. But the change in the message and the stance of the United Nations that happens under the closing as well as opening government is that the minimum bar is the threshold of which your moral responsibility is fulfilled. That's something that we've told you down the bench. What did Mustafa tell you? That now a minimum standard will be able to spur discussion as to you not being able to meet the minimum standard, and therefore we can talk about the ceiling and how much more you can take in. But we don't think so. More often than not, states are very able to market themselves as being able to meet the minimum standards of taking in refugees. For example, Australia is a key example. Sorry, Gemma. In that instance, ladies and gentlemen, there are two kinds of refugees: individuals that appear on your shores and individuals that are allocated to you by the UNHCR. Australia is one of the highest recipients of refugees that come into the UNHCR, and they use that fact to justify turning away both people that come onto their shores and individuals that come and need help in that instance, ladies and gentlemen. It's a very potent argument for individuals to say that you've met the minimum bar, as opposed to having the potent argument on the side of humanity that says that you still can accept more rather than meeting your minimum benchmark, ladies and gentlemen. We think they haven't answered that priority in this debate. Secondly, how do individuals then sidestep these quotas? Because the fundamental assumption on government is that rich countries like Germany and all these individuals will take in more refugees, because we don't think they've accepted this. We think they'll be able to sidestep your responsibility, because you'll be able to sell it to other countries and say, I fulfilled my responsibility then. The question we pose to this house is, where do these refugees go, and who do you sell these quotas to? That's why Rafiq's extension was very important. It is more likely than not that your quotas will be sold to the most unable to cope with the cost countries. For example, Indonesia, the countries like Guinea, like New Guinea, like Berat talked about in his speech, because these are the countries that are the first ones that are going to buy out your quotas and take in that money first. But why is that so, ladies and gentlemen? Because number one, it is more likely than not that these countries that treat refugees horribly are the ones that are corrupt and don't care very much about what the provisions for refugees. Secondly, they are more likely than not these countries that care about the immediate placating of their voting citizenry, ladies and gentlemen, by telling them, hey, we've gotten some money back, rather than saying that we're accepting this on the basis of humanity. That means countries like New Guinea, countries like Indonesia, many countries that treat refugees horribly, ladies and gentlemen, will buy this out for the immediate benefit of having money, ladies and gentlemen, rather than knowing the far-reaching implications of that policy. That means the countries that already right now taking in refugees will just buy out quotas for the immediate cash. We think that's horrible, considering the quality of life. That means the conclusion is you're legitimizing the trade and the transfer of refugees to countries that can't take care of those refugees under the side of government, ladies and gentlemen. Thirdly, let's talk about now the treatment of refugees, because we think that Berat's speech was primarily about where do these refugees go to in regards to whether they go to Saudi Arabia, whether they jump to some country just because they think they have a higher quality of life, and whether they're informed of those decisions. I already told you that most of the time the reallocation is already done by the UNHCR. But furthermore, we think that it's easier for countries to now say that that responsibility to reallocate is now no longer within the ambit of the UNHCR, but rather go into bilateral trades with countries that the UN has no oversight over, ladies and gentlemen. For example, I have a bilateral trade agreement with with Nauru, for example, or some random country in the world, and the UNHCR is no longer responsible for that reallocation. That's why we had such a problem, for example, when Australia chose to trade and sell off their refugees to Malaysia, because we thought that the UNHCR, the UN, didn't have oversight over that particular transaction. We think that only happens under that side of the house. But lastly, why is this exceptionally important in terms of the discourse of which the United Nations encourages? Ladies and gentlemen, we acknowledge under this side of the house, especially closing opposition, that the discourse that happens in your own country affects how you negotiate in the United Nations. When you have countries that have the UKIPs, the Golden Dawns, and the National Fronts, being able to now say that it's not a cause for humanity. It's now a cause of what number you represent on a budget somewhere in a parliamentary meeting. It's not about humanity. It's about how much money you cost. That is a much more potent argument to the people. That's something that disassociates humanity, human concerns, and the moral responsibility you hold to refugees, rather now you just become another number in another book. We think that that's why we must win this debate.
Thank you to all speakers. Please vacate the room and then talk about the debate. Please slip around in the other room. We'll announce the results in a few minutes, well, however long it takes.
Thank you.